This is symbols 3, which means that we're in the third of 12 presentations. And when these 12 presentations are finished, we will have not a line of lectures, but we'll have an arc of presentations. Rather than just being a sequence, this sequence has a tension. And so what would be a bar, a sequential bar, has a tension on both ends, and it pushes together the sequence so that it arcs. And with just the right expertise, the kind of yoga of civilization, one can tailor a sequence to exact specifications. The power of differential consciousness is that one can create the forms that one needs to initiate whatever tasks, whatever purposes that one can imagine. You can make conscious forms. You can make mental forms. You can make ideas in the shapes that you need for the purposes that you imagine, that you desire. Which means that mental forms, symbolic forms, the objective shape of ideas is malleable. Now, this is a great discovery. It is so great that it's called in English realization. And one of the great concomitants of the realization that mental objective forms are malleable. You can shape them in many ways. You can expand them, you can contract them, you can change the perimeters, you can design ideas to fit the purposes at hand. Now, creative ideas are something new. They're differential. They never occur in nature. Natural ideas are always rooted in the way in which the delivery of ritual, mythological combines interiorize and make symbolic spaces. That the inner world in nature is a direct response to and outcome of the physical actions and of the language evocations. In a material way, one says that the neural energy that's developed in the natural world, the neural energy comes into an interior world of form. The objective symbolic forms are filled with the content of neural energy, largely the neural energy being transmitted by language. Language transmit the energies that are there like the sap of existence, like the very stuff, the life that makes existence move and flow. And this neural energy fills the natural symbolic forms, just like one would have a cup and one adds water to the cup. The water fills the form of the cup, whatever shape the cup is, the water takes that shape. And what holds that water in the cup is a viscosity, a surface tension. And if one looked at water in a cup with some detail, if you looked with a molecular-sized inspection, one would see that the molecules of water form an electrostatic membrane called colloquially surface tension, and that the surface tension of water in a cup extends to the walls of the cup and then rise about 2 or 3 molecules up. so that the viscosity of a fluid, in this case water, filling a form, in this case a cup, is such that it seems to creep up a little bit around the edges and around the boundary, so that the appearance is that the water and the cup are one thing. So that the appearance, from a natural perspective, of neural energies in symbolic forms makes it seem, from a natural standpoint, that they fit together, that they're one thing. And it's only through power of resolution, it's only through very complex yoga, that one can patiently disentangle this ensemble and see that one is dealing with a pair, and each element in the pair is malleable. The form is malleable, and the neural energy is also fluid all the time. Its objectivity, its seeming shapedness is given only by virtue of the form. Whatever boundary the form has, whatever shape the form has, the neural energy fills that form. And by a kind of a surface tension, it's like a static electromagnetic field that's set up. The viscosity curls a little bit on the edges, and it seems like it's one thing. One can disentangle that. And when this is done, the phrase is very clear. I think the Zen koan, mu, known in Japan as mu, is the most succinct expression of it. All forms are empty. That when you disentangle a symbolic form from its neural energy content, the neural energy flows again, and the form discloses that it is in and of itself empty. And so the Zen phrase is, emptiness is form, form is emptiness. It's a reciprocity. The reciprocal nature of it is that emptiness and form are exchangeable. Not only that they're interchangeable, but they're exchangeable. Now, in the history of mankind in the high Mahayana, this was known as the exchangeableness of shunyata, void, with tathata, suchness. So that the oomph of existence is exchangeable with the void, empty openness of form. It doesn't mean that nothing exists. It means that what exists is always in this fluid state, and only provisionally and only conditionally does it meet the focused terms that one could then say we have objectivity. In nature, this is not possible to do. In nature, one cannot do this disentanglement. So that the disentanglement is always an art. And when the art is raised to high consciousness, it becomes a science. So that one runs across a phrase which has been used for thousands of years. And the phrase was made popular in the late 1960s by the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, courtesy of his guru, who wore leopard skins, courtesy of his guru, who was invisible in the forest and back thousands of years. The phrase was, a yogi master the art of living and the science of being. But as we will see in our education, that art and science do not occur in the natural cycle at all. They occur in a cycle which is complementary to nature, a cycle that in short form we would call consciousness. that consciousness has a cycle all of its own, but that cycle of consciousness, all of its own, is a pair to the cycle of nature. So that the cycle of nature pairs itself with the cycle of consciousness. And the two of them together form a very large whole. They form what we would call the real. Something real participates in both cycles at the same time and allows for exchangeability at any place in the mutual paired patterns. So that reality is at once the most fluid of all conceivable wholes, and it's also the most objective of any particular focus. The simple way of saying it, the fairy tale way of saying it, is that God's world is all and everything, is a place where infinity and zero are exchangeable. Now we're about to discover that the traditional forms of education that have been operative now for about 2,500 years, quite distinct from the forms of education that were there before. About 2,500 years ago, symbolic civilization was coming into being made. And instead of there being the dance rituals that were characterizations of Neolithic civilization, the symbolic civilization had language rituals, and one of the most basic of all language rituals for symbolic civilization was what we know today as logic. And that logic, rather than being an indication of intelligence, is simply an indication of ritual comportment on the most fundamental ABC level. And that mastering logic is a ritual action, has nothing to do with intelligence, and has nothing whatsoever to do with consciousness. And one can see right away that if these kinds of assertions are true, most of the education that people have on this planet is absolutely inoperative. So what's going on? What are they doing? What are they basing themselves? What are they making? In yoga, it's called Maya, illusion. There's nothing real there. What's real is that our evoked response is real. And to the extent that we continue to respond, there's something to work with. Whereas if we stop responding, hold in suspension our capacity to respond, don't confuse it with the refusal to respond. It's the suspension of the response to evocation. The entire illusion dissolves. Now, this technique is the technique of karma yoga. And the workbook, the ancient workbook of karma yoga, is the Bhagavad Gita. Someone like a Gandhi was able to show that you can still use the Bhagavad Gita as a tactical and strategic workbook. Gandhi's whole development of satyagraha, truth holding, was a way of suspending the responses to fictive evocations. And as long as there's one person in the mix who does not join into the evoked response, it begins to weaken the signal so that that illusion begins to lose power. The Maya station begins to go off air. And the more people that join in the suspension of response to the situation, the more that the situation dissolves back into its reality. Now, this is exactly what a yogi does in his own mind. He stops the habitual responses so that what is real can occur nakedly as it is. Don't push the river. If it's not a river, it's not going to flow. If it flows without you pushing it, there's something really there. What's really there in the mind of the yogi, when all responses are suspended, is a flow of neural energy that has no objectivity whatsoever. It's all pure process. But at the same time that it's all pure process, one can also observe, one can note. It's like consulting the palm of your hand. You can see that the symbolic forms also do not have an intrinsic value in terms of content. They are empty. They don't come from the universe or God or mystery or anything with any text whatsoever. They have no content whatsoever. They are, as we would say then, abstract forms, purely abstract forms, and they are empty. So what we're looking at today and next week and for the next 2 months is the way in which symbols are forms in the mind that give a provisional shape to neural energy largely in the transmissible code of language. And that what we're looking at here is indeed a very deep phenomenon. It's the way in which we put together, the way in which we integrate any and everything. And our education comes to a culmination in a couple of months. Comes to a culmination where you get a chance within this educational format, within this sequence that is being given an arc. In the 17th century, they used to call this particular set of tensed sequences, they used to call that the Royal Arch. The Royal Arch initiations, which survive in some circles even till today. Although later in the 17th century they were transformed out of the understanding on symbolic level, they were put into mathematics. And instead of having Royal Arch ceremonies, which someone would undergo ritually, you had Royal Arch ceremonies that translated into pure abstract symbols. And what was born out of that was the mathematics of calculus. Old Sir Isaac Newton in England and Leibniz in Germany, at the very same time, came to understand that when you take symbolic forms in their pure abstraction, in their emptiness of content, one can still bring creatively a manipulation of those symbolic forms into new symbolic shapes, and that there's a way of applying those new symbolic shapes to receive the flow of nature, and nature will distribute itself according to the shapes of those forms. That's why mathematics works in the physical world. The physical world shapes itself according to the symbolic forms that man makes. It was a tremendous discovery. It silenced Newton so that he was socially inept for the rest of his life. It jailed Leibniz in a royal library because they didn't want to let him out. These guys are dangerous. One of the great 20th century books about that whole age is called The Breaking of the Circle. Marjorie Hope Nicholson. The influence of Sir Isaac Newton's optics on the poetry of the 18th century. The breaking of the circle. Black Elk wrote one time, he said, "The hoop of the nation is broken." None of the old ceremonies are going to work again. Where men and women used to know how to dance for rain, the rain will not come now, though the dances are the same. Why? Because consciousness and nature are complementations. And when consciousness changes, nature responds to a different voice. And if you call in the old voice, it will not come. Once consciousness changes the forms, nature fluidly cooperates with those new forms and will not cooperate with the old forms again. Nature has a new name, and you have to use her new name now, and then she will come. What happens, though, is that there is a tremendous time lag because the change of forms is usually done by some few people who are pioneers, who are vanguards, who are maybe a century or sometimes 200 years ahead of everybody else. And nature, which has been working well in certain evocation patterns, seems to run coast, seems for a while still to respond, but the energy level goes further and further down until there comes a point where just the man on the street, the woman on the street realizes that something's wrong here, nothing's working. The time-honored gong of startling awake is to realize that what's operative in the phrase is that word, nothing. Nothing is working anymore in the old way. So we have to relearn what is now the new operative language. What are now the new symbolic forms that nature is really now responding to? She's going to dance to a different melody. She doesn't want to hear that old stuff anymore. She wants to hear what's new. So the whole purpose of an education like this is to alert people to the fact that there's a new language that works. And that the universe is ready to dance, but wants to have some new steps. But to learn that new language takes an education. That's the only reason of having any of this. If it were that the old language was still good, you wouldn't need an education. All you need is a yoga teacher. This is how we do it. ABC. Discipline yourselves, and after a while, go and do it. You can even get used to having it polished down to just little simple instruction. There have been ages when men and women could be just instructed as how to do things. It's called tradition. Tradition would just show you. You would grow up with it. You wouldn't even have to think about it. You wouldn't need an education. But in times when the symbolic forms change, then everyone needs an education. And all the old forms, the gurus of the old forms, are inoperative. They don't know. Everyone has to learn from scratch again. Doesn't matter how many times you've lived, how many yogas you have mastered. Frankly, there's several thick telephone books full of operative yogas of the past that have to be set aside. They're historical. The new telephone book is yards thick, and maybe only the first paragraph, the first blank page is covered and the rest is open. But what's there is an education like this that shows how to navigate around in the unknown and piece together for yourself what you need to work with. And that's why we're here. That's why we're doing this. And why is it so small? Why is this not worldwide? Well, give it a little time. Give it 10 years. But when you're making a new light, you want to be out in the forest someplace and make a campfire. Then try it out there. After a while, it can go out high, wide, and handsome. Now we're in the third of the symbols lectures, which means that if you look at the previous 3 series, the series on nature, which made an arc, the series on ritual, also 12 lectures that made an arc, the 12 lectures on myth, which made an arc, and now the 12 lectures on symbols are going to make an arc. If you put those 4 arcs together, then you get a circle. But one has to hold in suspension the term circle here and use instead the phrase that this is a cycle of nature. That those 4 arcs, nature, ritual, myth, and symbol, form a cycle of nature, and the process, the activity of that whole cycle is integration. What nature is all about is that it comes together, it clumps itself together, it likes to come together and be. It's as fundamental as gravitation. If you have an entire universe filled with nothing but high energy atomic quark plasma, eventually it will congeal into the visible universe that we have today, where there will be galactic clusters and large intergalactic spaces in between. There will be star clusters with large interstellar spaces in between. There'll be atomic clusters with nuclei with large interatomic spaces. So that the whole principle of nature is that it integrates, and as it integrates in certain focuses, all the rest of it becomes empty. But that the emptiness goes with the little clusters. So again, you have this sense that what is real in nature, what is real in the whole integration, is that tiny points control enormous spaces. It's like a work of art, like a powerful sculpture. If you look at a sculpture like Rodin's Balzac, there's one here in Los Angeles at the County Museum of Art, a reproduction of it. And you look at it in the context of the County Museum of Art, you don't get the full resonance of it because it's too cramped. It's too close to the building, it's too much vegetation. Whoever put it there didn't feel Rodin. But if you were like Rilke, the great poet who worked with Rodin and wrote a book on Rodin, and you realize that a Rodin sculpture is so powerful that it has to have a space commensurate with the weight of the work of art. Then you put Rodin in the right space, and the resonance is colossal. The only time I ever saw Rodin in the right space was in San Francisco. There's a place out near the Presidio called the Palace of Legion of Honor. It's an art museum. And right across from the entrance, about 100 yards out, are Rodin's The Three Graces. And in the background of them is the whole vast San Francisco peninsula, set in San Francisco Bay. And if you get into a deep aesthetic reverie with that Rodin sculpture, those Three Graces, you can hear the tinkle of buoys out in the Farallone Islands about 20 miles offshore. It's all part of the space that's complementarity to Rodin's powerful art. It needs a space about 40 miles in diameter to hold those sculptures. What we're going to discover is that the objectivity of an art form is many, many times more powerful than the objectivity of a mental form, which is already many, many times more powerful than a ritual form. And that ritual forms are very low on the totem pole. Very low. They're necessary because they establish the base, they establish existence. But very quickly, as soon as symbolic objectivity comes into play, ritual objectivity becomes a substrate to the symbolic objectivity. But what is even more astonishing is that when artistic objectivity comes into play, the more that it comes into play, the more that art objectifies in its way, ritual objectivity disappears from the scene. Not that it isn't still there, but it becomes, as we would say, post-Freud Jung, it becomes subconsciously there. And the principle is that of the square of attention. This principle of squares of attention, very important. We do not keep in view, in our appreciation, in our sensitivity to form, any more than 4 of these phases at any one time. And when a new phase joins into that square of attention, the last phase in that square of attention phases itself out and joins the subconscious substrate. Now, none of this becomes available until integration as a cycle is complete. One would not know this at all. In nature, there's no way to know this. Because the context of nature, the integral cycle, is so vast that only when one has moved beyond nature, only when one has gone beyond the integration cycle, gone into the differential cycle, that one can then retrospectively begin to understand what is happening, what is going on. And to the extent that consciousness begins to occur as a dimension of the real, to that extent, nature slips into, how did the Doors used to say, slips into unconsciousness. Remember that song, The Crystal Ship? Before you sink into unconsciousness, let me have another kiss, another lashing tress. The square of attention, of consciousness, signals a radical change, a transformation which is archetypal, which forever alters, because it is the first step beyond the integral cycle. So the whole discovery of what symbols are, what they mean, what they do, this whole activity about symbols is filled with mystery, it's filled with meaning, to the extent that it is so tightly packed that we're like a kid in the candy shop, that as soon as we begin to get it, we pop off all over and we don't put it together. And what I'm trying in this series of lectures is to let that royal arch of understanding symbols mature in such a way that one can begin to appreciate that this is a place where if one concentrates, tunes the perception, calibrates the conception, that tuning and calibration here pay off immensely. That attentiveness to symbols is like some kind of place where the hand of comprehension is able at last to get a hold on an ecology, a cycle, which otherwise would be so vast as to co-opt us in its structure, in its movement. So titanic is this radical change, this radical realization, so linked to the hand, that the first appearance of it with men and women was always symbolized by the hand. 30,000 years ago in Paleolithic art, one does not find portraits of men and women. One finds murals of the powerful animals that totemically held the energy of life. And on the fabric of the tapestry of that energy of life, in the shape of the large, powerful animals, the only sign that one finds, the only conscious symbol that one finds is the hand of man. And is put on in two ways, in a pair of ways. Because the advent of Paleolithic civilization, because as soon as you have art, you have civilization. And prehistoric Paleolithic painting signals that men and women are now no longer a part of some ecology of nature, but have emerged as a civilization. True, it's Paleolithic, but it definitely is true that it's also civilization. And the primordial symbol that controls, that focuses, ushers in, is that the hand occurs in a pair of ways. One, the hand is dabbed in the paint, in the berries, in the crushed minerals, and applied to the wall. The other is that the berries, the minerals, the paint emulsion is taken into the mouth, mulched with your sputum, and blown over the hand so it leaves a print out. So that you have a pair of ways. You have the ritual way, which is the hand on existence. And two, you have the symbolic way, which is the power of breath to give form, not only to spoken words, but through the exhaled pigment to give form to the symbolic hand. So that the ritual objectivity of the handprint and the symbolic objectivity of the breath print were the pair of ways in which Paleolithic art put them together and managed to step up to a third objectivity, that of the work of art itself. And as a key to it, the works of art do not occur helter-skelter, randomly in nature. They're always concentrated, always put together in caves. So that the cave becomes a transformed place. It is no longer a part of nature, it is now a part of man's conscious world. The cave has become a temple. The cave has become the first architecture. So that the Paleolithic art with the handprints and the advent of architecture makes it a civilization. But in order to get there, in order to understand this momentousness and what it means for us, because we live at a cusp where that Paleolithic civilization has transformed twice. It's transformed out of the Paleolithic into the Neolithic, and out of the Neolithic into the symbolic, and now in our time is transferring its whole energies to something else, yet again, some fourth level of civilization. You can't expect the Paleolithic forms to work. You can't expect the Neolithic forms to work. And surprisingly, you cannot expect the symbolic forms to work. Some new kind of symbolic forms are what work, and they must be discovered. They must be found. And in order to do so, one minimally needs a way to navigate in openness. One of the most successful human groups on the planet, even though they were very small in numbers, extremely extraordinarily small in numbers. The population never filled even a small town when they were all collected together, were the Polynesians. And the Polynesians learned to navigate on the Pacific Ocean, which is like more than half the planet. In all that wide water, we think the Phoenicians did a lot navigating on the Mediterranean Sea. The Phoenicians navigated on half the planet because they were able to navigate in pure openness. They were able to prorate star positions into open vectors, and they had the kind of courage to just keep going. And they plotted ocean currents as far as they knew, and star clusters as far as they knew. And then, like masterful archers, they let themselves fly to see where they would go. They trusted that the unknown has a shape which will respond to their navigating in the unknown. And it was true. And they were able to populate the entire Pacific. All of this without benefit of the kind of shipbuilding techniques that Henry the Navigator or Magellan had. We're in that similar kind of a situation. We're Polynesians of the interstellar lanes. Just getting on the beach for the first time with the first outriggers, getting set to go. And we have to have that kind of courage to navigate in a vast unknown, to navigate from what we have and go and find. If you're following some old way, those old ways all dead end. It doesn't matter how good they were. It doesn't matter how much bhakti you have. It doesn't matter how much karma you have. The jhana level doesn't matter at all. You can be as Raja as you want. That's not a play on my name. All of that is a different episode of the real. What's here now is something completely new, which can be found, can be discovered. And one of the curious early indications is that the universe now is so alive, so used to being evoked by man's creativity, that the new cosmos is totally free. It's totally creative. It doesn't like rote things at all. It likes new combinations and new combinations of new combinations. It likes the differential creativeness that men and women of the future will have. Men and women will finally get used to being completely free. Whereas 2 generations ago, just 2 generations ago, one of the great philosophic intellects of Europe, Jean-Paul Sartre, could write a book called Condemned to Freedom. That it was existentially daunting to realize that you couldn't count on anything ritualistically secure, that everything was totally free and therefore you were condemned to this existential unknown. And someone who is used to the comfort and security of the past experienced freedom as an angst. My God, what will I do? There's no one to tell me what to do, where it's safe. And that's right. There is no one to tell you what is safe. What is safe now is what was a peril before. It's like turned inside out. What is safe now is open water under new stars. That's what's safe. And it's safe for the most primordial of all reasons. Nature loves a courageous lover. And the courageous lover is trying in a new way to sing those new songs. And nature will help us discover what the words are, what the lyrics are, what the melody line is. And it may not even be a melodic line. It may be a melodic fractal. Who knows? But what we can say at this particular point is that the freedom to explore will be respected by the unknown. Let's take a break. Let's come back from our break. We're looking at symbols. This is symbols 3. And it'll run all the way to symbols 12. And then we'll do like we've done before. We'll have an interval break from the sequence so as to allow the sequence to float. If we kept on going, the sequences under the pressure would make closed circles. And generally, learning forms that end up as closed circles become very powerful ideologies. Circles of myth that become mythologies are so perforated by the mysteries of nature that they don't encase us in any kind of compelling form. But when it comes to symbols, when it comes to the mind, if you close a circle in the mind, the circle becomes like an ideological cookie cutter that then stamps its form on you, and whatever you do transfers that stampedness to all of your actions and other things. And so it's very important for someone who's teaching on this level to be experienced enough, not to mention knowing enough, not to do that, not to get caught in that. Our century has been ruined by ideological closed circles that have stamped themselves on people's lives and trampled ordinary happiness underfoot. So we're not wanting to do that and paying particular attention. And yet we have to have a continuity. One of the elements that we've been using all year long as continuity is to recognize that our movement through these various cycles of lectures, these various arcs, the 4 arcs of the 4 series of 12 lectures each, the substrate upon which these beads, these successions, these arcs of beads are strung, is controlled, is given, is made available to our sense of reality by choosing some kind of literary journey which we take for the whole year. That is to say, we've taken out of the literature of the world, out of fabulous journeys to take, literary journeys in the world, we've taken 2 examples, one a masculine example and one a feminine example of a journey which goes through a whole cycle of integration and comes back home. That is to say, the feminine cycle always returns back to a home base, and the masculine cycle never touches home base, but always explores the outer boundaries, the outer perimeters, and is only concluded when the entire shape of the boundary has been explored, but at no place does it touch home. And so I've chosen for the masculine journey one of the most uncanny literary journeys ever done, and that is Herman Melville's Moby Dick. And Moby Dick is like an archetypal masculine journey of self-discovery in nature. It leaves port and never returns. The Pequod, instead of returning home to its port, ends up on the bottom of the ocean. And the only thing that survives is a coffin that floats on the surface of the water, and one man clings to the coffin, Ishmael, who becomes an orphan in the universe. Whereas the feminine cycle always, no matter how complicated, no matter how vast or nefarious the resistance is, always finds a way to come home. And the Odyssey by Homer is that kind of a cycle. It seems at first, well, now Homer's a man, the Odyssey should be a masculine work. It's not at all. The Iliad is a masculine work. But the Odyssey is a feminine work. You can even hear it. If one heard the Iliad chanted in classical Greek, you would hear this formidable, relentless pace of doom in the very meter of the work. Whereas if you hear the Odyssey in classical Greek, it has a light, skipping, tripping, sonorous way of delivering itself, a melodic line that continues and explores everywhere. The very recitation tones of hearing immediately tell you that they're two different things. And what makes the Odyssey's journey work are the women in it. The mythic images of the various women are the rulers upon which the story flows, without which the story would not flow. There's Circe, there's Calypso, there's Athena, there's Nausicaa, there's Penelope, there's Helen. It's the women, Euryclea, the maid, all of the women are the images which allow for the story to flow, for the language, for the fluidity of the language to complete its cycle. Whoever Homer was, he knew his stuff. When you read the Iliad, you realize that he was some man who at one time had seen battle up close in a way that when you see it, you don't yearn for it anymore. There's no glory in that. There's a phrase in the Iliad where a spear comes through the back of the head of one of the Trojan warriors, and it so surprises this monstrously strong man that he's been speared through the back of the head that his teeth clamp onto the blade of the spear as if it were a metal tongue. It falls into the dust. Homer understood that. But in the Odyssey, there are qualities of the melodic line, of the feminine image that allows for language to move in this kind of lightning, scintillating way so that it has the amperage to complete its cycle. There are places in the Odyssey where there is a masculine tone that is struck that stops the men, but permits the feminine narrative line of the Odyssey to continue. And we've used the Odyssey and Moby Dick as year-long reading journeys to help give us an integration template against which to pace ourselves. So that when the education of the first year is over, we close the book on those journeys and set them down. And then for the second year, we have two other journeys which we can choose one or the other. And the reason of choosing one or the other is to give a kind of a polarity to the population of the persons here. It's called an anthropological language, a moiety, making a population of a tribe divided into complementarities that as long as they're distinct, they function as polarities. Because when you have polarities, you have an energy between them that's able to respond to resistance by increasing its power. It's like electricity works because of the resistances, and the electricity flowing through that makes the power because it overcomes these resistances, and the amperage is what carries it through, the voltage, the measurement of that success. But we'll see in the second year that there's something else involved here. That instead of there just being an electromagnetic energy in the universe, there's a whole other scale of energy. Rather than electromagnetic energy, there's also magnetoelectric energy. It's the complementation to electromagnetic energy. And its scale of amperage, its voltage is about 10 billion times. So that magnetoelectric energy, at about 10 billion times the intensity of electromagnetic energy, walks through matter made up of coagulated electromagnetic energy as if it weren't there. A being in a magnetoelectric body would walk like a cosmic phantom through the solid matter of this electromagnetic half of the universe. What we're trying to appreciate with these year-long readings is a way of carrying through the whole year, because the important thing is to distribute our attention. Make sure that our attentiveness is distributed through the whole year and not get glommed on to those one or two or few points that really are of terrible interest to us. And because we cover such fundamental qualities, there are moments on certain Saturdays which will be indelible because they're evocative for you at your particular stage, wherever you are. Something in you responds to this or to that, but whole vast stretches are indifferent. It's because of a faulty education. It's because of faulty background. That's not anyone's fault. It's the way things are. Whereas if you go through this process a couple of times, you notice that all of it is of interest. The distribution is more even. And that's why this is a kind of a master yoga. Evenness of mind is yoga. One realizes that rituals are just as interesting as symbols. The mythologies are just as important as the natural occurrences. But this is so in a balanced way because they all form a part of an integral cycle. And that integral cycle has in itself a center. There is a single focus of the entire integral cycle. And that focus, that center of the entire integral pattern of nature's reality occurs at the very center of our interiorization. You can call it the soul. You can call it the deep self. You can call it the Atman. Whatever you want to call it. It's been called many names. But perhaps a new kind of language is that it is the smallest aperture of openness in the universe. That rather than being a point, it's a focus of energy. And because energy focuses there from all through the entire sphere, if you have an education that arranges an implosive charge on the entire sphere of the integral cycle, you get at that focus all the meaning that there is, whether you've explored it or not, whether you're knowing of it or not, whether you're feeling towards it or not. And this, of course, one recognizes in 20th century technology, the development of atomic power. That the very nature of atomic power, the triggering of the chain reaction that would release the splitting of the atom, was all contingent upon having an implosive charge, which was totally spherical. And it's to Robert Oppenheimer's great credit that he was the first person to conceive of how one would actually do this. Einstein's mathematics was very clear, but to translate that into the physical, technological stuff and technique of how you do that was elusive. Till Oppenheimer one day, in hearing a conversation, heard the right phrase and he got it. That instead of having an explosion large enough to trigger a nuclear reaction, one reversed the entire energy of it, and instead of having an explosion, you had an implosion. An explosion just throws it further and further out, but an implosion can be balanced. You can make the charges, you can engineer them so they're exactly the same everywhere in an entire sphere, and the entire force of the implosion focuses at one particular point. Not a point that's something, but a point which is the focus of the force. And that focus is so powerful that it splits the atom, because atomic structure cannot hold against that kind of concentration. In just the same way, the illusionary forms of Maya cannot hold their structure or their shape in view of the yogic concentration of the implosion of all meaning. And one releases the nuclear energy of conscious differentiation. One begins to see, not only in terms of the electromagnetic universe, but also in terms of the magnetoelectric universe, much higher energy, much higher frequency. And one no longer is baffled by the opaqueness of things and their mysterious happenings. One can see through, not only see through things, but see through processes and understand. And on this level, what one discovers is that you are totally free in an infinite cosmos. And that's the good news. But in order to help us shape this, in order to help us hold our appreciation in such a way that we don't get overcome by our own capacities, our education has such an old-fashioned, simple thing as taking a literary journey through the whole year, through the 52-week cycle of the first year, and then again the 52-week cycle of the second year. So that we take a pair of journeys that help us to focus this. Now, if you've come far enough that you have a feel for this, if you understand what I'm saying, if you appreciate in your own way that what you're doing now is getting into this level of operativeness, here's a possibility. If it's true that in reality, complementarities are able to exchange and operate in each other's column, as it were, then it should be possible to replace the ending of one of these literary journeys with the other. And one could appreciate this most rare of all occurrences, a masculine journey that has a feminine ending, or a feminine journey that has a masculine ending. It's not only theoretically possible, it's very doable. But it takes a lot of, not courage so much, but chutzpah to do this. If you've been following the Odyssey, the place to make the shift for this little experiment is to shift over in the 44th week in our outline of the program. The readings of the Odyssey and the Moby Dick are distributed throughout the entire year by readings, and when you come to the 44th week in either one, just begin reading in the other. The place in Moby Dick where this shift takes place is a short little chapter. It's only this long. It's called The Cabin. And the cabin is a little conversation that Captain Ahab has with the little cabin boy, the little black cabin boy, Pip. Pip, who has fallen overboard off the Pequod into the ocean, and he was down under the water for a long time, and when they fished him out, he had changed. They said that Pip was mad, or that Pip was mystical, or as Melville says, Pip had gone so deep into the ocean that he saw God's foot on the treadle of existence, and it woke him up in such a way that he was no longer ordinary. Ahab, who has been cursed by evil, struck completely by evil all the way through, so that the only way that Ahab can function is as a polarity brought together into a final conflict. The only way for Ahab to keep the two pieces of him together is to pit it against some final conflict. In the ordinary world, he would have been split apart. So here, the cabin conversation between Ahab and Pip, and it reads somewhat like this. Lad, I tell thee, thou must not follow Ahab now. The hour is coming when Ahab would not scare thee from him, yet would not have thee by him. There is that in thee, poor lad, which I feel too, curing to my malady. Like cures like, and for this hunt, my malady becomes my most desired health. Do thou abide below here, where they shall serve thee, as if thou wert the captain. Aye, lad, thou shalt sit here, in my own screwed chair, another screw to it thou must be. And so Ahab is going to exchange places with Pip, the cabin boy. He will sit in the captain's chair, and Ahab will go where Pip had gone, under the ocean, deep enough to see God's foot on the treadle of existence. And when he leaves, Pip, in his magic, mystical, little boy's oceanic, shamanic way, says, Here he this instant stood. I stand in his air, but I'm alone. Now, were even poor Pip here, I could endure it, but he's missing. Pip, Pip, ding, dong, ding. Who's seen Pip? He must be up here. Let's try the door. What? Neither lock, nor bolt, nor bar, and yet there's no opening it. It must be the spell. He told me to stay here. Aye, and told me this screwed chair was mine. Here then I'll seat me against the transom in the ship's full middle, all her keel and her three masts before me. Hear old sailors say, in their black 74s, great admirals sometimes sit at table and lord it over rows of captains, lieutenants. Ha! What's this? Epaulets, epaulets. The epaulets all come crowding. Pass round the decanters, glad to see ye, fill up, monsieurs. What an odd feeling now when a black boy's host to white men with gold laced upon their coats. And so you get at this moment, in Moby Dick, an exchange point. It's opportune for someone with a little bit of navigating courage to exchange the literary journey of Moby Dick for that of the Odyssey now. And where in the Odyssey, at week 44, do we come to? But the place at the beginning of book 22 where Odysseus throws off his disguise. He's been disguised as a beggar in his own hall, in his own home. No one has recognized him except the old dog that still smelled his master, except the old housekeeper, Eurycleia, who recognizes the scar on his foot that he got when he was a little boy. But he's hushed her up and said, only bring my son Telemachus here. Only tell Telemachus. And some old shepherd who was a warrior at one time. And Odysseus tells them that he's going to go into the hall where there are 105 suitors eating him out of house and home. And they've arranged a contest to see who wins Penelope and the kingdom. That they've taken the double axes off their hafts and put the axe heads, 12 of them in a row, so that only the hole in the axe head shows, and whoever can shoot an arrow through the 12 axe heads will get the kingdom and get the wife and get to be Odysseus, get to be in his place in the world. And Odysseus has counseled his son and the old warrior and the old housekeeper that the day of death has come for the suitors. And Telemachus, being only 21, says to his father, "But father," it's just like Brandon D. Wild and Shane saying, "Shane, there are too many. There are too many." And Odysseus says, "But we have allies. The gods will be with us. Zeus, Athena." And Telemachus says, "But father, these are stories that you tell children." And Odysseus says, "For men like us, they will be there." And so at the end of book 21, when none of the suitors can string the bow of Odysseus was this pair of ram's horns. And the twirled thong hide string was very difficult to string up because the ram's horns had to be bent by colossal strength and by very subtle technique together, strength and craftiness together, in order to get it strung. And none of them could string it, so they couldn't even shoot the arrow. So the beggar says to the old housekeeper and the old warrior, "Make sure that the doors are bolted, not to keep them out, but to keep them in." And then he Now the noble swineherd took the curved bow and carried it, but all the suitors in the palace cried out against him. And thus would go the word of one of these arrogant young men. "Where are you carrying the bow, you sorry and shiftless swineherd? Those swift dogs that you raised yourself will feed on you beside your pigs, forsaken by men. If only Apollo and the rest of the immortal gods are propitious towards us." They spoke, and he took the bow and put it back where it had been, in fear, since many men were shouting at him in the palace. But from the other side, Telemachus spoke and threatened him. "Keep on with the bow, old fellow. You cannot do what everyone tells you. Take care, or younger though I am, I might chase you out to the fields with a shower of stones, and I am stronger than you are." And so the bow is passed to Odysseus, disguised as a beggar. So the suitors talked, but now resourceful Odysseus, once he had taken up the great bow and looked it all over, as when a man who well understands the lyre and singing, easily holding it up on either side, pulls the strongly twisted cord of sheep's gut so as to slip it over a new peg, so without any strain, Odysseus strung the great bow. Then, plucking it in his right hand, he tested the bowstring, and it gave back an excellent sound like the voice of a swallow. A great sorrow fell now upon the suitors, and all their color was changed. And Zeus, showing forth his portents, thundered mightily. Having heard this, long-suffering great Odysseus was happy that the son of devious devising Cronos had sent him a portent. He chose out a swift arrow that lay beside him uncovered on the table, but the others were still stored up in the hollow quiver, and presently the Achaeans must learn their nature. Taking the string and the head grooves, he drew to the middle grip, and from the very chair where he sat, bending the bow before him, let the arrow fly, nor missed any axes from the first handle on. But the bronze-weighted arrow passed through all and out the other end. And Odysseus spoke to Telemachus. "Telemachus, your guests that sit in your halls, does not then fail you. I missed no part of the mark, nor have I made much work of stringing the bow. The strength is still sound within me. And he spoke and nodded to him with his brows. And Telemachus, dear son of godlike Odysseus, pulled his sharp sword about him, closed his own hand over his spear, and took his position close behind him next to the chair, bright in bronzed armor. Now resourceful Odysseus stripped his rags from him and sprang up atop the great threshold, bending bow and the quiver filled with arrows, and scattered out the swift shafts before him next to his feet. And then he goes through this old warrior technique. It's like a card sharp who's laid the cards out and can't just flick them at will. And he begins with a rapid automaticness of slaying all of them until they are all dead. At these points, Moby Dick and the Odyssey, the exchange of one seeming identity for another. Ahab no longer is the captain of the Pequod, but becomes some mystical surrogate for the little cabin boy who is already drowned. And in the Odyssey, the beggar who is returned home turns out to be the real king. That the return of the king in a feminine mode is not the return of the king as a masculine, proud warrior, victorious, but the return at the very lowest rung of mankind, coming in as a disguised beggar, coming in disguise. That sometimes, in order to complete a cycle, one must come in disguise and not in triumph at all. The masculine way would be in triumph, but sometimes the cycle is in a feminine mode, and one wise enough to understand that comes in disguise, so as to complete rather than so as to perfect. Now, the exchange of these two journeys, is all contingent on, rests upon a quality that language has. The quality is that language is evocative. All language, the sound, the tone of language is evocative. Something similar happens, and if you get interested, you can read some of the philosophy of something like this in a book called Sound and Symbol, Music and the External World by Victor Zuckerkundl. It's in the Bollingen series from Princeton. He also did Man the Musician. Whenever sound is put into tones that are paired, and those paired tones are in sets, like an octave in Western music, or in a pentad in Chinese music, as long as one has a scale and a paired tone structure, all of the powers of sound distribute themselves into the shape of those indexing symbols. Those are symbolic forms that index the power of sound and condense and distribute them exactly at those energy levels. It's just like in the electromagnetic spectrum. When matter in the electromagnetic universe forms, it forms only exactly where the electron clusters of energies are able to focus. In the hydrogen atom, there's only one electron because there's only one place that it focuses. Unless it goes into deuterium or tritium, in which case you can up the energy ante. But usually one jumps from hydrogen to helium because the electron energy focuses pair themselves up so that in helium one gets this quality of pairedness, whereas in hydrogen the pairedness is the electron and the proton, the nucleus and the electron. And all the rest of matter prorates itself on the development by the ways in which energy levels are able to register. Electrons will only cluster, they will only focus electromagnetic energy will only happen in certain select distributed areas. In other areas, they do not register at all. There's no energy whatsoever. The same as in planetary systems for stars. Planets only collect in certain harmonics. If you have multiple stars, as most star systems are, the planets collect in very interesting kinds of harmonics. The mathematics of this, incidentally, was worked out about 350 years ago by a man named Kepler. And it turns out that the harmonics are based not on circles, but upon ellipses. Because the centers are never, in the case of planetary systems, the stars, but always the center of the gravitational polarity between the stars and the planets, called the barycenter. It's some vacant, focused place in space that's the center of a star system, not the star itself. The same way in atomic structure, the same way in any kind of sound structure or any kind of energy structure. In this case, language, words are all symbolic forms which set the indexing for the set of the way in which the power of sound arranges its effectiveness, and nature reciprocally responds to that structure. Mythologically, one says, as soon as man learns to name, the world becomes what those names are. As soon as one can sing the tune, nature dances. Maya is no longer static, but dances. Shiva's dance of energy is Shiva Nataraja. And that dance can be learned to the point of mastery. And so too, all language is evocative. But evocative in learnable, in discoverable ways. Certain levels only are operative. They can be learned. They arrange themselves in sets, and those sets arrange themselves in symbolic forms. One can master this. Now, there are many complicated ways in which to divulge how this happens. The simplest way is the old Indian legend of how the Ramayana came to be written. There was a sage who was meditating in the forest in his retreat so long, sat in the same place so long, that the white ants that lived in that area of the forest had built their anthill over the sage. And he was completely covered by this. That's why the sage's name was Valmiki, the white anthill sage. And meditating for long generations in that forest had become the conscious center of the entire forest, and all the trees and animals and birds were a part of the pattern of that consonance. One day a hunter from a faraway district came into that forest, as the legend goes, and with a bow and arrow shot one of the birds in the forest. And the bird, dying, gave out this cry, and this cry alerted the powerful Valmiki, so that instantly he cursed the hunter, and the hunter, just as the old Indian legends say, he shriveled into a wisp of soot that blew through the trees for a few seconds. And Valmiki then, meditating on the power of language, on the fact that his curse had come out in a special way, in a paired, lined way. That paired, lined phrase became the Sanskrit poetic atom called the sloka. The paired line that can pair up with another paired line and make like a quatrain, make a four-part, make a square of attention. That stanza, that phrase, became the basis upon which all Sanskrit poetry was arranged, and the whole Sanskrit language. The Rig Veda, all the Vedas, all the Upanishads, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, All of it, all of Sanskrit literature, all of the wisdom of India is based on that atomic structure of the evocative nature of language, discoverable by Valmiki in a flash response to a plaintive sound. So language has this evocative character, so that when language interiorizes, it carries with it this feeling tone capacity to excite, not to exact, but to excite reciprocity from the world. So that when language interiorizes and gains a lot of power, the deeper that language goes into the interior world, the more meaning power it gets. And when it goes very deep, into the deep substrates, into the deep centers of the interior world, words which are single phonemes, like Om, gain tremendous energy to evoke from nature certain responses, so that the power of mythic language becomes intensified in symbolic form. And so symbols, when they are handled with comprehension, evoke the shape-shifting quality of the flow of nature itself. The mystery of nature responds immediately. And if one utters a language which is designed to awaken more and more of nature, more and more the universe comes alive. It comes alive to respond, even if there is only one being speaking but one language. It activates, and one can learn, one can understand, one can deepen, so that a single Bhagavad Gita spirit warrior could activate the entire universe, call it all forth, bring it all alive. And when the universe as a whole is alive, life itself becomes the common denominator of every atom in the universe. And by its nature to integrate and come together, comes to an implosion of meaning, comes to a place where the atomic structure of Maya is shattered forever. And what steps forth is Shiva Nataraja through that ring of fire, through that circle of flaming language into consciousness. In some whole other dimension of time-space comes into reality, comes into play. And from then on, reality is no longer just space and time, but space and time and consciousness. And a whole other universe, one that we now have to call a cosmos. Then man is no longer a natural creature, but he becomes a cosmic being. Then he is worthy of being at home, wherever it is that he is dancing. More next week. I would like to end with a quotation, one of the sections of Moby Dick called A Squeeze of the Hand, just so you get the feel of how in a masculine journey, the preparation for this transformation, this momentous transformation, takes place. All alchemy before the transformation has a stage where everything is dissolved. The old alchemical formula was dissolve and recoagulate. You have to first dissolve, so that the first stage in a pair of processes in alchemy is solution. One seeks for the solution not in itself, but what the solution delivers. What does the solution deliver? A solution delivers the possibility of radical transformation of time and space by allowing for the dimension of consciousness to co-participate everywhere and give a new structure. That's the gold, not the stuff that one pounds, the stuff that shines. That's the light. Chapter 94 in Moby Dick, a squeeze of the hand. They take the sperm from the sperm whale and put it into a tub. And the sperm goes into these globules. And so by hand, they have to squeeze these globules apart to keep it fluid so that they can boil it down. So it's called the squeeze of the hand. It had cooled and crystallized to such a degree that when with several others I sat down before a large Constantine's bath of it, I found it strangely concreted into lumps here and there rolling about the liquid part. It was our business to squeeze these lumps back into fluid, a sweet and unctuous duty. No wonder that in old times the sperm was such a favorite cosmetic, such a clearer, such a sweetener, such a softener, such a delicious mollifier. After having my hands in it for only a few minutes, my fingers felt like eels and began, as it were, to serpentine and spiralize. As I sat there at my ease, cross-legged on the deck, after the bitter exertion at the windlass, under a blue, tranquil sky, the ship under indolent sail, and gliding so serenely along, as I bathed my hands among those soft, gentle globules of infiltrated tissues woven almost within the hour, as they richly broke to my fingers and discharged all their opulence like fully ripe grapes their wine, as I snuffed up that uncontaminated aroma, literally and truly like the smell of spring violets, I declare to you that for the time I lived as in a musky meadow. I forgot all about our horrible oath. In that inexpressible sperm, I washed my hands and my heart of it. I almost began to credit the old Paracelsian superstition that sperm is of rare virtue in allaying the heat of anger. While bathing in that bath, I felt divinely free of all ill will or petulance or malice of any sort whatsoever. Squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. All the morning long, I squeezed that sperm till I myself almost melted into it. I squeezed that sperm till a strange sort of insanity came over me, and I found myself unwittingly squeezing my co-laborers' hands in it, mistaking their hands for the gentle globules. Such an abounding, affectionate, friendly, loving feeling did this avocation beget, that at last I was continually squeezing their hands and looking up into their eyes sentimentally, as much to say, oh, my dear fellow beings, why should we longer cherish any social acerbities or know the slightest ill humor or envy? Come, let us squeeze hands all round. Nay, let us all squeeze ourselves into each other. Let us squeeze ourselves universally into the very milk and sperm of kindness. Would that I could keep squeezing that sperm forever. For now, since by many prolonged, repeated experiences, I have perceived that in all cases man must eventually lower or at least shift his conceit of attainable felicity, not placing it anywhere in the intellect or in the fancy, but in the wife, the heart, the bed, the table, the saddle, the fireside, the country. Now that I have perceived all this, I am ready to squeeze Case eternally. In my thoughts of the visions of the night, I saw long rows of angels in paradise, each with his hands in a jar of spermaceti. More next week.